Procrastination is not proof that you are lazy. It is proof that your mind has learned how to make the start feel heavier, scarier, and more exhausting than it really is. That is why the battle is almost never about the work itself. It begins in the few seconds after you decide to act. You open the laptop, reach for the book, sit down at the desk, and suddenly your mind starts talking. Maybe you should prepare more. Maybe you need a better plan. Maybe you should wait until you feel clearer, calmer, more motivated. Maybe 5 more minutes will help. And because those thoughts sound reasonable, you obey them. Not because you are weak, but because your brain is skilled at protecting you from discomfort before momentum has a chance to form. This is where most goals quietly die. Not in failure, not in lack of talent, not in some dramatic collapse. They die in the doorway in the first few minutes, before real action ever begins. So you are not failing at the task. You are failing at the threshold before the task. And once you see what is actually happening in that threshold, procrastination stops looking like a character flaw. It starts looking like a mechanism. And if it is a mechanism, it can be broken. What makes procrastination feel so painful is that it seems personal. It feels like a weakness in your character, a failure of discipline, a quiet sign that you do not want success badly enough. But in most cases, that diagnosis is wrong. Procrastination is not usually a personality flaw. Tobuant, it is a design problem hidden inside the way a task begins. Your brain is not naturally wired to choose what matters most. It is wired to choose what feels immediate, clear, light, and rewarding right now. That is why checking your phone feels easier than opening a blank page. That is why cleaning your desk feels better than writing the first paragraph. That is why watching one more video feels easier than stepping into work that is mentally demanding, uncertain, and slow to reward. The brain moves toward what feels simple and away from what feels heavy. This is where the real variable enters. Starting resistance. Starting resistance is the invisible friction between deciding to act and actually crossing into the first minute of real action. It is the psychological weight sitting at the entrance. The task itself may be doable. You may even want to do it. But the threshold feels costly. It demands focus, effort, uncertainty, and emotional exposure before momentum has had any chance to help you. That is why most people do not procrastinate because they hate work. They procrastinate because the beginning of the work carries too much mental friction. The first step is unclear. The demand feels too large. The reward feels too far away. And when the point of entry is badly designed, even motivated people keep drifting toward easier alternatives. So this is the clean reframe. You do not lack motivation. You are living inside a structure where starting the right thing feels harder than starting the wrong thing. And if that structure stays the same, procrastination will keep appearing like personal failure when it is actually a predictable outcome. Later, we will use a deceptively simple entry method to cut through that resistance. Not as a productivity hack, but as a doorway through it. Because the cost of this pattern is bigger than lost hours. Every time you delay, you teach your mind something about who you are. Tong so, Sin. Bamoy, you almost never procrastinate in a dramatic way. You rarely say, "I'm abandoning this goal," or "This no longer matters to me." That is not how procrastination usually sounds inside the mind. It sounds softer, smaller, and far more reasonable. Punam. It says, "Let me check one thing first. I should make coffee before I begin. Maybe I need a clearer plan. I will start after I answer this message. I should research a little more before I write." And because each excuse feels harmless by itself, you do not notice that every one of them is performing the same function. It is moving you away from the point of entry. Watch how it happens in ordinary life. You open your laptop to work, and within seconds, you are scrolling. You sit down to study, then suddenly need water, better lighting, cleaner notes, a more organized desk. You change into workout clothes, but before the first set, you check your phone and disappear into 10 minutes of distraction. You want to write, but instead of writing the first sentence, you start outlining, renaming documents, organizing ideas, and calling preparation progress. You tell yourself you are still close to the work, when in reality, you are orbiting it. That is the real pattern. The procrastinator rarely avoids the whole task in one large decision. The procrastinator avoids the beginning through repeated micro-deviations. Tiny turns, small delays, minor detours, movements that look innocent enough to justify, but repeated often enough to replace action with motion around action. And each pattern has a mechanism behind it. Sometimes the first step is too vague, so the mind resists because it doesn't know where to enter. Sometimes the task feels too heavy, so the brain reaches for a lighter substitute. Sometimes starting requires too many decisions, and that mental load becomes friction by itself. Sometimes the real work offers a slow reward, while the distraction offers an immediate one. In every case, the mind is not asking, "What matters most right now?" It is asking, "What feels easiest to step into with the least discomfort?" That is why the most important work often triggers the strongest resistance. The more meaningful the task, the more pressure you attach to it. The more pressure you attach to it, the heavier the entrance feels. And the heavier the entrance feels, the more your brain starts generating intelligent-sounding reasons to delay. So here is the insight beneath all the visible behavior. You do not procrastinate through one big decision. You procrastinate through dozens of small decisions that look completely harmless. And that is exactly what makes procrastination dangerous. It does not destroy your goals loudly. It destroys them quietly, by training you to confuse avoidance with preparation and busyness with progress. Once you see that pattern clearly, another question naturally appears. If these tiny detours are so easy to fall into, why does motivation almost never save you for very long anyway? A lot of people still believe motivation is the missing ingredient. They think, when I feel inspired, I will finally lock in. Tomorrow, I will have more energy. Once I am in the right mood, I will do this properly. But that belief is exactly what keeps procrastination alive. It sounds hopeful, but in practice, it becomes a polished excuse. It turns delay into something that feels temporary, reasonable, even intelligent. Motivation is unreliable for one simple reason. It usually shows up after movement, not before it. It is not a stable fuel source you can summon whenever you want. It rises and falls with sleep, stress, environment, emotion, uncertainty, and 100 invisible variables you do not fully control. So if your ability to begin depends on feeling ready first, your consistency is now chained to a state that constantly changes. And even when motivation does appear, it is weak against friction. A vague first step can kill it. A messy workspace can kill it. A long task list, a notification, an open tab, a little uncertainty, a few seconds of hesitation, and the feeling is gone. This is why people can want something deeply and still fail to start. The desire is real. The structure is broken. That creates a sharp difference between two kinds of people. One person waits for the right internal weather. They look for clarity, confidence, emotional certainty, the perfect state of mind. The other person does something far less glamorous and far more effective. They reduce the size of the entry. They make the first step so small, so clear, and so easy to enter that it does not require a heroic feeling to begin. That is the real divide. One person asks, "Do I feel ready?" The other asks, "How do I make starting easier?" One negotiates with mood. The other designs around mood. One lives at the mercy of inner fluctuation. The other builds a starting point that still works on tired, distracted, imperfect days. This is why waiting to feel ready is such a dangerous habit. It gives procrastination a respectable face. It makes delay look thoughtful, responsible, even strategic. But most of the time, It is just avoidance wearing better language. You are not preparing to begin. You are postponing the discomfort of beginning. So the procrastinator does not lack dreams, ambition, or sincerity. What they often lack is a way to start that does not depend on mood. That is the missing piece. Not more desire, not more pressure, not more guilt. A reliable point of entry. Real discipline does not begin in emotion. It begins in structure. It begins in the design of the first move, the shape of the entry, the reduction of friction. Because if starting still depends on feeling right, procrastination will return the moment the feeling disappears. And the deeper danger is not just that weak motivation slows your progress. The deeper danger is that every delay quietly teaches your mind what kind of person you are. After enough repetitions, that lesson stops feeling temporary. It starts becoming identity. Every difficult task begins with a moment that looks small, but carries enormous consequences. The task appears, resistance rises. The work feels heavy, unclear, emotionally expensive, or just slightly unbearable. Then comes the delay. Not a dramatic decision to quit, but a subtle move away from the start. You check something else. You tell yourself you will begin later. You promise that you will return when you feel clearer, calmer, or more ready. And for a brief moment, that delay gives you relief. The pressure drops. The discomfort softens. You feel lighter. But that relief never stays relief for long. It quickly changes shape. First into guilt, then into self-criticism, then into that familiar, humiliating recognition that you did it again. You knew what mattered. You intended to begin. And still, you did not move. That is where procrastination stops being a time management problem and starts becoming a psychological wound. Because every repeated delay leaves behind more than unfinished work. It leaves behind evidence. After repetitions, the mind stops treating procrastination as an exception and starts treating it as a pattern. And once it becomes a pattern, it hardens into expectation. This is what I do from now, who I am. The first cost is time. Hours disappear into distraction, fake preparation, low-value tasks, and mental loops that create the illusion of movement without any real progress. The second cost is momentum. Once you avoid the beginning, the task rarely feels easier later. It usually feels heavier. Now you are carrying not only the difficulty of the work itself, but also the weight of your previous avoidance. Yesterday's hesitation becomes today's extra friction. But the deepest cost is trust. Each time you tell yourself that you will start, and then fail to start, you damage your own credibility. Your plans begin to sound weaker inside your own mind. Your commitments lose force. Your intentions stop feeling like decisions and start feeling like wishes. And that shift is devastating, because self-respect depends partly on evidence. When your mind gathers enough proof that your words do not become action, it updates the way it sees you. That is the real danger. The most dangerous thing is not that you procrastinated today. The most dangerous thing is that you may be using that delay as proof that you are not reliable. You are teaching yourself repeatedly that your future self cannot be trusted with your present promises. And once that lesson starts settling in, every new goal enters hostile territory. This is where identity gets rewritten. You begin to believe you are the kind of person who always delays, always hesitates, always needs pressure, always breaks promises to yourself. You stop fighting only the task in front of you. You start fighting your own accumulated memory of failed beginnings. That is why goals rarely die because you are untalented. They die because somewhere underneath all your plans, you stop believing that you will begin when it matters. And when that belief weakens, something larger starts collapsing with it. Ambition weakens. Courage weakens. Your willingness to trust your own potential weakens. Procrastination repeated long enough does not remain a behavior. It becomes a lens. It becomes the way you interpret yourself. So if you do not repair the point of entry, the next thing that dies will not just be another task, another deadline, or another good intention. It will be a stronger version of you. And once that pattern spreads across months and years, it will not just delay your progress, it will quietly shape your entire life around repeated failure to begin. Look closely at where most goals actually die. They do not usually die in some dramatic collapse. They do not die because you made one giant mistake, chose the wrong life strategy, or suddenly lost all potential. Most of them die in the same place, at the threshold, in the first few minutes. In that narrow space between deciding to begin and actually entering the work. That is true for almost everything that matters. The book you wanted to write, the body you wanted to build, the skill you meant to master, the business you wanted to start, the career move you knew you should make, the habit you promised would finally stick this time. These goals rarely fail because the blueprint was terrible. More often, they fail because the entry point kept defeating you again and again until the future slowly gave up on your intentions. This is why procrastination is not just about losing time today. It is about losing accumulation across years. Every failed start costs more than a single session. You lose a rep, a page, a workout, a difficult call, a day of compounding, a chance to turn effort into identity. And the brutal truth about progress is that meaningful results rarely come from one burst of intensity. They come from repeated starts that stack into skill, proof, momentum, and confidence. When you keep missing the beginning, you do not just delay action, you interrupt accumulation. And once accumulation breaks, confidence breaks with it. You stop trusting your ability to build. You stop believing your effort will stack. You become more dependent on mood because structure is no longer carrying you. Then a dangerous life pattern starts forming. You know a lot. You plan a lot. You think a lot. But you execute very little. You become one of those people who are rich in insight and poor in movement. Full of potential, but short on proof. Capable in theory, inconsistent in reality. That pattern does not stay small for long. Miss enough starts, and you begin to lower your expectations for yourself. You choose smaller goals, not because they are truly enough for you, but because they feel safer than another failed beginning. You become careful with ambition. You stop trusting excitement. You start protecting yourself from disappointment by wanting less, aiming lower, and postponing what still matters most. That is one of the cruelest paradoxes of procrastination. The people trapped by it are often not lazy and not incapable. Very often, they are intelligent, reflective, highly self-aware, and able to imagine many layers at once. But that intelligence can become part of the trap. The more possibilities you can see, the more risks you can imagine, the more imperfections you can predict, the easier it becomes for your mind to argue against starting now. You call it preparation. You call it strategic thinking. You call it waiting for the right conditions. But many times, it is simply sophisticated delay. So the future keeps getting robbed in the same exact place. Not at the finish line, at the doorway. That is why the first few minutes decide more goals than motivation ever will. Because motivation can excite you, but it cannot rescue a badly designed entry point. If the threshold stays too heavy, every new ambition eventually gets dragged back toward the same old fate. New notebook, same hesitation. New routine, same avoidance. New vision, same collapse at the start. And that is the urgency here. If you do not lower resistance where the work begins, the next chapter of your life will not be shaped by your vision. It will be shaped by your repeated inability to enter the work when it is time. That is also why a 5-minute method is not small. It is aimed directly at the place where most of your goals are quietly dying. And now we are finally at the point where you can see why changing those first minutes changes everything else after them. This is where the game changes. You do not need a method that forces you to finish everything. You need a method that gets you through the doorway. That is what the 5-minute start is for. The rule is simple. You do not commit to completing the whole task. You do not promise 2 hours of focus, a perfect study session, a full workout, or a finished draft. You commit to one thing only: entering real action for 5 minutes, not fake preparation, not organizing your tools, not opening tabs and calling it progress. Real action. If you need to study, 5 minutes of studying. If you need to write, 5 minutes of writing. If you need to train, 5 minutes of movement. The purpose of those 5 minutes is not to create a performance of discipline. Team on. The purpose is to break resistance. That matters because resistance is loudest before motion begins. The mind does its best work at the threshold. It inflates the size of the task, magnifies uncertainty, and starts bargaining before momentum exists. It says this is too much, too messy, too long, too tiring, too unclear. But once you begin, the task changes shape. It stops being a burden and becomes action. You are no longer staring at the mountain. You are taking one step on the path. This is why the 5-minute start works at the level of mechanism. It lowers friction. It reduces fear around large tasks by shrinking the demanded entry point. It cuts internal negotiation because the commitment is too small to justify a long argument. It creates momentum because action changes state faster than thinking does. Most importantly, it gives your brain new evidence. It teaches your mind, repeatedly, that you are someone who can begin. That is the real shift. The old frame says, I have to do all of this. The new frame says, I only have to enter the work. The old frame makes the task feel heavy before you touch it. The new frame makes the start small enough that your mind has fewer reasons to block the door. You do not need to love the work before you begin. You only need to begin small enough that your mind cannot keep winning the argument. Think about what this looks like in real life. If you need to study, your 5 minutes might be reading 1 page and taking notes on the first paragraph. If you need to write, it might be opening the document and drafting the first ugly lines without editing. If you need to work out, it might be doing the warm-up and the first set. If you need to clean, it might be clearing one surface or handling one category of mess. If you need to do a difficult work task, it might be opening the file, writing the first email, reviewing the first problem, or making the first decision. The point is always the same. Define an entry that is concrete, active, and too small to trigger overwhelm. But the method only works if you use it correctly. One mistake is turning 5 minutes into an excuse to do the bare minimum forever. That misses the point. The 5 minutes are not the finish line. They are the entry gate. Another mistake is being vague. If you say, I will work for 5 minutes, but do not define what the first 5 minutes contain, your brain will fill that ambiguity with hesitation. Another mistake is leaving too much friction around the start. If your desk is chaotic, your tools are scattered, your phone is beside you, or the task requires 10 decisions before action, resistance still has room to win. Another mistake is using the method only when you feel motivated. That turns a structural tool back into an emotional tool, which destroys its power. So no, the 5-minute start is not a trick to fool your brain. It is a structure that makes the right action possible. It lowers the cost of entry until action becomes easier to access than avoidance. And once that happens often enough, the first 5 minutes stop looking like a compromise. They become the place where discipline begins to grow. They become proof that movement can happen before confidence, before inspiration, and before the mood arrives. And that is why this method changes the entire game. It does not ask you to become a disciplined person before you act. It lets action begin first, then allows identity to catch up. Each 5-minute start becomes evidence. Evidence beats intention. Evidence beats self-talk. Evidence beats mood. The more often you begin, the less dramatic beginning feels, and the less power resistance has over future decisions. But if you want those 5 minutes to build real discipline, not just rescue you on difficult days, then they cannot remain an emergency tactic. They have to become part of a repeatable system. If you want the 5-minute start to become more than a rescue tool, You have to turn it into a system. And that is where real discipline begins. Discipline does not come from forcing yourself harder every day. It comes from designing the point of entry correctly, then repeating that design until beginning becomes normal. So make the system concrete. Decide the important task before the moment arrives. Do not wait until you are already tired, distracted, or emotionally unstable to choose what matters. Choose it early. Then write down what the first 5 minutes actually are. Keyboard, not work on project, not study more. Define the entry. Open the file. Solve question 1. Write the first paragraph. Do the first set. Clear one surface. Next, clean the environment around the start. Remove clutter. Put the phone away. Close extra tabs. Reduce competing options. Most procrastination does not need a dramatic obstacle. It only needs 3 easy exits. Your job is to close them before the work begins. Then track the right metric. Do not only track outcomes, track starts. Track how often you entered the work when it was time. Because every beginning is more than progress on a task. It is a vote for a new identity. That is the shift. The old self asks, "Do I feel like doing this right now?" The new self asks, "What are the first 5 minutes?" The old self waits for willingness. The new self designs the doorway. And that is how self-trust comes back. Not through promises, through proof. The disciplined person is not the one who always feels ready. It is the one who knows how to begin before doubt speaks. From here, the question is no longer whether you have enough motivation. It is whether you are ready to design your starts like someone serious. Procrastination was never proof that you were lazy. It was proof that the way you were entering your work was too heavy, too vague, and too easy for your mind to escape. That is the real shift. You do not need to become a different person before you begin. You need to make the beginning small enough that doubt cannot win before action starts. From now on, stop asking, "Do I feel motivated?" Ask, "What are the first 5 minutes?" That is the identity change. You are no longer the person who waits for the perfect mood. You are the person who knows how to enter the work before your mind talks you out of it. So after this video, choose one thing you have been avoiding. Not 5 things, 1. Then write down the exact first 5 minutes and do them today. Make the start visible. Make it easy to enter. Make it harder to escape. And if you are done negotiating with procrastination, comment, "I start before doubt speaks." You do not need more motivation. You need a start so small your mind cannot escape it. Fix that point of entry, and you do not just change one task. You change the kind of person you become.